I'm Wing Ho. I'm a front-end developer at Data61, and today we're going to be going on an animation journey. We're going to spice up our web work with some animations. Now, you could be thinking, oh, Wing, what does CSS animations have to do with accessibility? If we have a look at this animation, we've got on the screen, we've got a box that kind of slides in from the bottom, and we're just toggling that with two buttons that open and close the slide. And for the purpose of the animation, I'll show you the code first. It's just a bit of styling, and we're animating the opacity and the top properties here. And there's a 600 millisecond on those top and opacity properties. And for the purposes of the animation, it looks fine. It performs well, but it's got some underlying things that we can improve. And those two things that we'll cover today is that we can actually improve the performance of this animation, and we can actually make it more accessible. So I'll go over the performance stuff, and once we've done all that, we'll jump into the accessibility side of things. And so when we look at performance, we're wanting to narrow down in a particular part. We want to pick something that we want to optimize. And one of the things that we can look at is how the browser actually renders things out. And when we're talking about rendering, often touted notion or number is that we want to render things at this 60 frames per second. And we go for 60 frames because that's like the typical display refresh rate of your digital display that you're consuming these websites on. And that just means that for every second, the screen actually updates 60 times. And so if we're trying to update the screen 60 times a second, that leaves us with only 16 milliseconds to render out each frame. And if we take browser overhead into account, we actually have about 10 milliseconds to calculate every single frame. And as soon as we exceed this 16 milliseconds, we'll actually have visible stutter in our UI. And that's not something that we want. So knowing that we've got only 16 milliseconds, we can have a look at what we need to do in 60 milliseconds. So we've got the DOM, and we've got some JavaScript and styles that we have to calculate out. And after that happens, we have 3 steps afterwards: the layout, paint, and composite steps. And we'll dive into what CSS affects each of these steps. First of which is the layout. And whether you trigger this with JavaScript or CSS, it triggers the layout regardless. And these are properties such as width, height, font sizes, and top left, which we saw in our animation. And so when a layout change occurs, the browser has to go in and do the paint step and the composite step all over again. And there are some optimizations for the browser to figure out exactly which area of the browser changes, but it still has to go through those steps regardless. And this is an expensive part of the cycle, so we want to avoid being in the layout section. Similarly, it goes for the paint cycle, and some attributes that affect paint are background image, text color, and shadows. And the composite layer is where we want to actually animate our properties. And the two properties that get offloaded to the GPU, the graphics processing unit, is opacity and transform. And these are very cheap and quick to perform. So we want to limit animations to opacity or transform where possible. And so if we look back to our sliding box, we can see that we're actually animating on opacity, which happens in the composite layer, but we're also doing top, which happens in the layout. And we can improve this because there's also the translate Y, which animates on the Y-axis. And I've simply added a translate Y on the transform property, and we're transitioning the transform property. And this results in very much the same animation as we saw back here. It's the exact same. And so we move from being in this layout section of the render cycle over into the composite layer. And that means that we're able to hit our 16 milliseconds more. And one thing that I'll just skip over this for time's sake. We will talk about why we want to do this. One of the things that we could easily forget is that we're all developing on probably what everyone would consider it as a very high-end laptop, or you've got all these computers that you work with every day. But your users might not be accessing your website or your web app from these high-end laptops. If they're on a low-end mobile device, they're going to notice these performance things more. And if you have the majority of users just don't see what developers might be experiencing. Like if we aim for these low-end devices, we can also capture the higher end. And performance gains, whatever type of user you've got, battery life improvements can improve all sorts of users. Everyone gains from that. We get a smoother experience, and we get a better engagement with our website or our web apps. So we've covered the performance side of things, and we're all here to learn about how to make things more accessible. If we look back to our sliding box, we can see that we're actually animating the opacity here as well. Does anyone want to take a stab at why that could be problematic? So with opacity, if you set it to 0, you're not actually removing it from the DOM. It's still inside the DOM. The browser still renders it. It's just set to something that a sighted user can't see. But your screen readers will actually still go through and get caught on these elements that aren't intended to be focused on. What can we do about this? We've got some JavaScript-free solutions. We can either apply a display none, or we can toggle the visibility to hidden. And there's a minor difference between the two. You might think that they do the same thing, but they don't. Display none actually pulls out this particular element from the DOM, and that means that you don't spend calculations trying to render this thing out if you don't need it anymore. But if you've got something that you want to keep inside the flow of your DOM, like you want it to still take space, you use visibility hidden, because the browser will still render out this particular element. It'll just choose not to display it. And screen readers will typically acknowledge this as well. The one thing that we can add is the RE hidden tag, but that requires a bit of JavaScript. We'll touch on that later. But the problem with both of these solutions, so-called, is that they actually break our CSS animation. If we try to toggle the visibility, we can see that the box will slide in, but we actually lose our animation when we toggle it out. And the reason why that happens is because when you remove the active state, you actually jump straight into that visibility hidden, the base state. And so the browser doesn't display that 600 milliseconds of animation that you want it to display. If we try doing this with display none, it's actually worse. We get no animation. We just get something that flickers on and off. And this is because of that minor difference between display none and visibility. Display none, it doesn't know where to animate from when it's in its base state. So if it's not rendered out by the browser, it doesn't know where the starting point was to animate. But there's a trick with visibility hidden that we can actually use to fix this. And that is, because the element is still rendered out in the DOM, we can add a delay for this visibility property to be applied. And so if I apply a delay of 600 milliseconds for this visibility to trigger, we'll actually get our original animation back from opening and closing this slide. However, that's just for the visibility property. If you want to apply this in a display none scenario, you can't, because of the way that the browser interprets those two things. And of course, if you've got a really complex animation, say it's like a multi-step animation, and you want to add another step, you just have to then go back and change your delay property. And that can quickly get out of hand, and it's just not scalable if you're trying to build complex animations. So what do we do from here? We turn to our good friend JavaScript. So if we take a dash of JavaScript, we can improve the accessibility of these animations. And when a CSS animation or a transition or animation event finishes, it will trigger off a transition and or animation end event. And this is something that you can use JavaScript with to listen for and apply whatever you need to do in order to make it more accessible. And so what we can do is we can just add a transitioning class for whenever we need to make a transition. And once that transition has ended, we can take off that transitioning class and do whatever, like we can apply that visibly hidden. And this ensures that we sync up our representation of our website or web app to whatever the between sighted users and your keyboard or screen reader users. So we've got these solutions, but there's no real best solution because of the way those two different things work. You have to look at what you're trying to build, and if you know what the outcome of your particular case is, then that should kind of point you in the direction of which particular solution you want to apply. At the end of the day, you'll still need a bit of JavaScript in order to toggle your ARIA classes or ARIA roles attributes. Today we've been talking about these so-called accessible sliding boxes. And you might be thinking, oh, well, I don't have any sliding boxes on my website. Why do I need to do this? If we think about sliding boxes, we can actually think about a sliding modal, because this particular pattern can be applied to something that feeds in from a modal. And I just want to quickly touch on how to make these modals a little more accessible. The thing with modals is that they tend to be they don't lay out as nicely as you would hope them to. If you've got a user clicking some button, the HTML for this particular modal might be placed somewhere else. And so you kind of have to manage that focus for when a user makes that action. And you can do this by grabbing whatever element that you're trying to introduce, and you just call the focus method on it. If we're trying to change the user's focus, you might be arguing that this is hijacking the user's focus. Oh, it's bad. But if you think about what you're trying to do with a modal, you're actually trying to bring something to the user's attention. So for a screen reader user, you actually need to give them the same experience and pull them into whatever you're trying to do with that particular modal. And finally, you just want to make sure that your users can actually exit out of the modal. So make sure that you can focus on a button or something that allows everyone to be able to actually come out of this modal. So we've talked about how to make this animation performant. So we just want to keep our animations to transition on transforms or opacity when possible. So if you've got some other, say you want to animate the width, or not width, font size, for example, you can probably scale that instead of changing the font size. And this makes sure that we stay in that last part of the cycle that we saw earlier. And there's that will change property. And that kind of hints to the browser that this particular element is going to be changing. So the browser will do some optimizations because it knows that it will be changing in the future. And that way you can do those calculations before the movement of whatever you're trying to animate begins. We've looked at how to make them accessible. We want to make sure that we keep the state of these modals in sync with whatever kind of user we have. We want to make sure that we correctly manage the user's focus and make sure they don't get stuck in these modals. You can fix these modals with visible hidden or display none in addition to the ARIA hidden attribute. And we've got these accessible modals or accessible sliding boxes. But again, this very same pattern can be applied to a whole variety of other things. So you can make accessible modals, menus, docs, and even toast notifications to some extent. You can apply the very same things when you're trying to animate these things. And so I encourage you to go out and try CSS animations. Don't be scared of them because you feel like you might make your website or web app less accessible, because it is possible to have them while staying accessible. Thank you.